Captagon.
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 In Douma, Syria, December 2024, rebel fighters and local residents walked into what the sign outside calls potato chip factory, but opening the doors and going inside, the machinery has nothing to do with potatoes. 53 years of Assad family rule comes to an end in a matter of days in December 2024. What gets uncovered in the weeks after was what had the appearance of a drug cartel that ran a country, a true narco state.
الشعب السوري بالساحات للمجد بيرفع رايات عم يهتف بثلاث كلمات الله وسوريا وبشار كنيسة وجامع متحدين ولمحط بعنوان الدين وملايين السوريين وما بدهن إلا بشار
Captagon was never a Syrian invention. A West German company called the Gusa Pharmagruppe first created it in the 1960s under the name phenethylene. It worked the way most amphetamines work: alertness, euphoria, appetite suppression, and if you take enough of it, I'm sure also wide eyes and a swinging jaw, what's called gurning in Australia. By the 1980s, most of the world had banned it outright once the addictive potential of it became impossible to ignore. The compound, however, resurfaced years later across the Middle East under the same brand name, but it was a counterfeit product manufactured by nobody connected to the original patent, using a cheaper and considerably more dangerous formula built around caffeine and low-grade amphetamine rather than the original phenethylene. Chemical analysis of seized pills show how frequently they contained highly toxic adulterants, including heavy metals and even highly potent research chemicals. And because of the chaotic chemical profile of these counterfeit pills, it makes them way more addictive and destructive to the central nervous system than the original 1960s prescription ever was. It found its most reliable customer base amongst young men in the Gulf states, where a pill costing roughly $1 to produce could be sold on the streets for up to 20. Syria had a marginal role in the trade for years before the civil war made it a central revenue stream for the ruling family. Sanctions imposed after the Assad government's response to the 2011 uprising cut Damascus off from most legitimate channels from hard currency. Even a government under sanctions, however, still has salaries to pay, militias to fund, and of course a family to keep in the style its members have grown used to. Captagon solved the problem with a speed that nothing legit could match. The chemistry is simple enough that some analysts have said that it requires little more than a basic knowledge of chemistry and a few scales. By the early 2020s, estimates of the trade's value ran as high as $10 billion a year, a single pill that was now outperforming every legal export the country had left. It ran through the 4th Division of the Syrian Arab Army, one of the most powerful units of the entire military, commanded by Maher al-Assad, the president's younger brother, and perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most powerful men in Syria, regardless of his brother's title. US Treasury designations describe the 4th Division as running a portfolio of revenue schemes that stretched from cigarette and mobile phone smuggling up to full industrial-scale narcotics production. Maher wasn't running this alone, and he wasn't running it only through soldiers. His cousin, Samir al-Assad, oversaw major production facilities in Latakia, coordinating directly with the 4th Division and its associates tied to Hezbollah. One factory linked to Samir produced a shipment of 84 million pills worth an estimated $1.2 billion that Italian police intercepted at the port of Salerno in 2020. At the time, this was one of the largest drug seizures in European history. Another cousin, Wassim Badia al-Assad, ran his own trafficking operation and became notorious enough that even after the regime's fall, Syria's new interior minister had to lure him back across the Lebanese border from a hideout in Tripoli under a covert operation they called Black Gold Ambush, arresting him the moment he crossed back over the border. A third relative, Montir al-Assad, ran a car dealership in Latakia that residents raided after the regime's fall, finding pills concealed among the vehicles, pills that ended up strewn across the street in the sewers outside. Outside the family, however, the most important name in the trade belonged to a Lebanese Syrian dual national named Hassan Dakau, a former car dealer the press nicknamed the King of Captagon. The cow bought property on both sides of the Syria-Lebanon border, specifically for production and storage, operating under protection from powerful figures in both the Syrian and the Lebanese security forces. He was arrested in Lebanon in 2021 in connection with a massive shipment intercepted in Malaysia on its way to Saudi Arabia, and according to the US, associates from Hezbollah helped him keep business afloat even when he was sitting in prison. Hezbollah's role ran deeper than protection money. The group had decades of experience running its own drug operation, and by some accounts, the Assad regime drew directly on the expertise once it decided to build a Captagon industry of its own. Lebanese villages along the border became nodes of this new smuggling network. In 2021, Indian customs officials recorded the export of 400 barrels of diphenhydramine, which is something found in over-the-counter allergy medicine and cough syrup. The barrels were bound for a Syrian pharmaceutical company. The paperwork carried approval stamps from 3 separate Syrian ministries. 10 tons of the compound in a single shipment is far beyond what any legit pharma operation would need, according to experts. The barrels moved from Gujarat through the port of Beirut and into Syria, where investigators would later trace them to a fortified palace on the Damascus-Beirut highway, sealed off by the 4th Division for over a decade. The same place, whose halls were found, after the regime fell, stacked floor to ceiling with barrels and industrial mixing equipment. By 2023, the trade had now become large enough that Assad started using it as a bargaining chip in his own diplomacy. Syria had been expelled from the Arab League in 2011 over the government's crackdown on protesters, but by the early 2020s, several Gulf states were discreetly exploring whether to bring Damascus back into the fold. It is speculated that Assad was using Captagon as leverage to get back into the Arab League. Captagon was flooding the Gulf's youth with cheap amphetamines, and Gulf governments would have every incentive to negotiate with Assad rather than to isolate him. From this viewpoint, you could say that Assad behaved less like a head of state and more like a mafia boss, holding the entire region's public health hostage in exchange for sanctions relief and a seat back at the table. Jordan didn't wait for Damascus to make good on any informal bargain. Beginning in earnest in 2023, the Jordanian military started launching direct airstrikes into southern Syria against smuggling infrastructure tied to trafficking networks that Amman accused Iranian-backed militias of running with the regime's tacit protection. These were far from surgical or bloodless operations. A January 2024 strike on the town of Orman killed 5 people in a single home, including a woman and her aunt, among at least 18 casualties reported across the course of the raids. Assad's drug empire, along with his regime, would fall in only 11 days. A rebel coalition led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham launched an offensive out of Idlib under the name Operation Deterrence of Aggression, aimed initially at a handful of towns near the Aleppo front line. The Syrian army that had held that front for years didn't manage to hold it this time. Aleppo fell within 2 days, its garrison collapsing rather than fighting. By the time rebel forces had reached the outskirts of Damascus, they were advancing against an army that had, in large part, already completely fallen apart. Maher al-Assad, commander of the 4th Division and the man who spent over a decade running the country's drug trade from behind the same uniform, was given the unfortunate task of organizing the defense for the capital. He appears to have actually taken the assignment seriously, under the impression that the army's retreat from other fronts was a deliberate consideration for one final stand in Damascus. It wasn't. The army's chief of staff had already ordered a general withdrawal, and by the time Maher discovered this, his attempt to countermand the order came too late to matter. Rebel forces entered the city on the 8th of December with almost no resistance left to overcome. That same day, Bashar al-Assad boarded a plane out of Damascus. Russian state media confirmed within hours that he landed in Moscow, where his government was granted asylum. 53 years of Assad family rule and 13 years of civil war came to an unceremonious end for the Assad clan. HDS leader Ahmed al-Shara gave his victory speech at the Umayyad Mosque, calling the fallen regime a Captagon factory that would now be purified. Within days of that, his fighters and ordinary Syrians, walking into abandoned military and intelligence compounds, discovered exactly how literal that description was. Anyway, that's all for today. Adios.